I don't think that the doctors, I'd like to give them some credit that I don't think they knew that either. I mean, I really don't think that they understood fully that that was what they were doing to me. That, you know, 50 years later, I was going to be pre-diabetic, have fatty liver, have, um, you know, cholesterol problems, have all kinds of things because of every year that I was doing all these horrible diets, that was what was going to happen to me, and that I would end up, being 360 pounds or whatever it was at the end of it, even though I was eating seriously less food than all of my skinny friends and eating kind of healthy.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science, a brand new podcast from Work P2P. It's great to have you here. So I am here with two of my good friends, Dr. Emily Cooper and Andrea Taylor. And the three of us, every week now, are going to be bringing you all information about the science of why we get fat. Thanks for being here.
It's so great to be
Hi.
here, Mark and Andrea.
I want to start, Dr. Cooper, with why we decided to start this podcast. And for full disclosure, I've been a patient of yours for 10 years. Andrea has been a patient for a number of years. Yeah, about the same.
About the same.
And so let's start with the why of this podcast, Dr. Cooper, because there's a lot of information that every week that we're going to be bringing people that I think is going to be surprising to people. So let's start there. Let's go to the why.
Well, we're hoping that we'll be able to cover some interesting topics around the field of metabolism and the science of metabolism and bring that to people in a way that they can really grasp what's behind body fat, blood sugar, insulin, all types of chemistry that we think of when we're thinking about obesity, diabetes. And there's so much misinformation out there. So our big goal is to really bring the science to our audience so that they can make more informed decisions.
Andrea, you have sort of lived every diet that's been out there, right? Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I think that I've been on a diet probably until I hooked up with Dr. Cooper and figured out what my problem is, because I call her like a metabolic detective. But I probably have been on a diet since I was maybe 8 years old, was probably my first one. And then we figured that I probably had been on maybe 36, 38, 40 diets maybe. And then the other day I tried to add up how much weight I had lost and gained like during a lifetime. And I lost count because I'm terrible at math, but I lost count after 1.5 tons, which was like over 1,000 pounds.
Gosh.
And which is really, because I was like, I think I've lost like a ton of weight. And then I added it up and literally it was a ton of weight because it was like over 1,000 pounds, which I was like, oh, that's kind of depressing. But then I was like, well, it's kind of good because like since I've been with Dr. Cooper, I've actually kept it off, which the other 1.5 tons I actually had gained back, which I was like, oh my God, that's like a forklift of, or like in my business, it's a dumpster's worth of weight, which was like, oh wow, that's like a lot. I can't lift that. So anyway, that's a lot. And what I hope, and I think we have talked about this before, what I hope will happen from this is that we can talk about what's going on inside the body, and that the word metabolism won't be like, oh, hey, she has a good metabolism, she has a bad metabolism. Because all my life, that's what I always heard, like, well, you got a bad metabolism, girl, it's not going to work. But we can find out what it really is all about and realize that you don't have to be on some deprivation diet that I've been on, which we can talk about those. I mean, Weight Watchers, Atkins, Scarsdale, Miami, Beverly Hills, like name a city, I've been on their diet. And like, we don't have to go on some kind of starvation liquid thing, keto. Like, those are all teasers, I guess, for like an episode I think that we're going to do
Mhm.
about all these terrible diets that everyone thinks are so great. Um, but we don't have to do that anymore. There are ways to make this happen, and we don't have to feel like it's our fault. And once I got um, sort of a medical combo of it's it's not your fault, which took my brain a lot to understand that it wasn't my fault and that there wasn't something I had to actually do and figure out, and it wasn't the calories in, calories out, which we'll talk about in an episode, that was like a bunch of crap from, 100 years ago. Um, it sort of gave me this freedom and a literal took weight off my
Mhm.
shoulders to make it so that I could get to the next
Yeah.
step. And I want to somehow help other people feel that same thing.
Yeah, this podcast is going to give people hope, and more importantly, it's going to give people hope that's rooted in science. And
In total,
I
right,
mean,
in total facts.
everywhere we look these days, Dr. Cooper, every day on my Instagram feed, I'm getting some pitch about some fasting program or some diet program, and it's just everybody says they have the truth. But the reason that we wanted to bring you to the front of this podcast is that for decades now you've been treating metabolic syndrome and metabolic dysfunction in your patients.
Mhm.
So I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Cooper, about how you got interested, first of all, in metabolic dysfunction, and when was it that you saw that as the primary driver to so many health problems?
Well, I tend to be a problem solver to begin with. So I love problems and I love to just kind of take them apart and try to find solutions. And so I in my medical practice had different areas of interest. And then at one point, I was working with patients who had eating disorders, and I started noticing some really interesting metabolic changes that they were going through, and some of that you could explain because they were really in a starvation state, so that could impact the metabolism. But then a little bit later, I started to see patients with higher body weight that would seek out my expertise for different things. And looking at those patients, I started to see the exact same picture as I saw in the patients who were significantly malnourished and significantly underweight. So that really kind of piqued my interest, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to start looking further and further into the science behind this. And when I first started working with people at higher weight or with diabetes or prediabetes, I thought the problem is that we're not using, you know, smart enough technology to figure out what they should be eating, how they should be exercising. So I was also guilty of that. And that was, of that kind of thinking. And that was, gosh, I hate to say, but it was like almost, it was 25 years ago or so. Um,
Hmm.
and so I started to implement testing with the highest quality equipment to measure your calories in, calories out, your exercise expenditures, all of this really detailed information, and I'm very good at spreadsheets. So spreadsheets that were individualized to the person. And I thought that's where we've gone wrong. We haven't really taken these measurements or applied them correctly. But after a while, I started to notice you could force the body to lose weight or change your glucose levels in the short term using that methodology. But in the long run, the body would come and fight back. And the basis of that seemed to be similar to what I was seeing in the patients who were significantly malnourished. It was these high famine signals that were circulating in the body. So then I
Hmm.
thought, hey, this is a problem that could keep me busy for a long time. I should
Yeah.
focus on this one because I like problems. So that's kind of how I got into it. And I just enjoyed the challenge of it. And I also felt really, I kind of had a lot of, just sympathy for patients who had been treated by the medical profession the way they had been, of the blaming, you know, the um, the disbelief when patients would try to tell their medical professionals, "Hey, I'm eating this much, I'm exercising this much. How in the world can I be still gaining weight or not losing weight?" And the typical medical explanation is, you're under-reporting your food intake, you're
Right.
over-reporting your exercise. And
Yeah.
so I felt, a real passion just to try to do my part to try to help that group of patients that had been so mistreated medically.
Yeah. And I should say that Andrea and I and all the rest of your patients have the advantage of having had this stuff explained for years, and it does take a while. For those people listening, Dr. Cooper, that don't know about the feedback loop. So in these patients, the anorexic patients versus the patients with too much weight, you're measuring a very sophisticated uh, hormone chain within the body, from the brain to the organs and muscles and fat. And so explain, if you would, just briefly what the feedback loop is, and how you measure those hormone signals that tell the body kind of what to do, whether to store calories or burn calories, right?
That's a great question because we do have equipment where we can put a mask on a patient, measure their expenditure, their energy expenditure by looking at the exhaust, what they're breathing out. It can actually tell us how many calories they're burning, whether they're burning carbs, whether they're burning fats. And so a lot of people think that's enough. That's the way to measure someone's metabolism. The problem with that is it's a snapshot of the metabolic system over the 15 minutes that you're measuring. And then also, it's really a picture of what the metabolism is doing, not necessarily the health of the metabolism. So we can look further and get more information by looking at blood work. And the blood work that we can look at is pretty extensive. There are some limitations. It's not like we have access to all of the tests that are used in research studies, for example. But clinically, we can order tests that measure some of the hormones that our body fat produces that are beneficial and send those positive signals to our brain that we are in a secure nutritional environment. We can also measure some of the signals from our gut. We can measure some of the signals that our brain is sending out after it receives its input signals. Once it determines whether the body should actually increase the energy expenditure, store more fat, whether it should put the brakes on the metabolism or the accelerator. So we can actually get a pretty good look at the metabolic system through extensive lab work. And the best way to look at it is actually both fasting and after eating just a regular meal that you normally would. That's a balanced meal.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I'm going to just briefly share my story and how we came together. Um, we reached out to you when I was in television because we were going to do a Get Fit segment on King 5 in Seattle, and we thought it was just going to be this fun little thing where a doctor would tell us to do this and that, and we'd lose 10 or 15 pounds, and we'd look great, and we'd go on with our lives. That led to, I don't know how many hundred episodes that you
It
did with
did.
King 5 on
Mm-hmm.
metabolism. But the long and short of it is, after you evaluated us, and specifically me, you came to me and you said, I think you have metabolic syndrome. And I was like, well, what's that?
Yeah.
I was pre-diabetic. My blood sugar was high. My blood pressure was high. My cholesterol was high. My family doctor for years had been saying, hey, try to get more exercise, try to eat a little better, but nothing was working. And I come from, at least on my dad's side of the family, sort of bowling ball shaped men, and that's when I started I became one of your patients. Um, and 10 years later, I'm 50 pounds lighter. All of my numbers are optimal, and it's a miracle, really. And we're starting to lower the medication levels that are treating the metabolic syndrome.
Right.
So that's sort of my story, and that's how we got to know each other. And so genetics, I'm sort of like the poster child for how genetics can look in
Yes.
terms of metabolic dysfunction. I'd love to know from Andrea. I mean, so another thing that affects metabolic dysfunction is dieting and
Yes.
depriving the body. And
Hmm.
Andrea, so take me back, Andrea, when you were a kid, like what was going on? Did your parents think, oh, she's too heavy, let's start depriving the calories? What
Yes.
happened?
Well, I think I had the genetics against me
Mhm.
because we've actually done genetic testing,
Hmm.
and I had a bunch of the genetic markers that said, pretty much you're going to be obese. You kind of have that against you. So I had that going against me. Um, but yeah, definitely, it was always one of those, oh, you'd be so great if you could only be thin, or doctors. I went to every kind of program, every single thing. Let's do more exercise. Let's only eat pistachio nuts for a couple of months. I mean, seriously, let's just eat hot dogs. Let's just eat cabbage soup. I mean, some of them were from doctors. Some of them were from just like, oh, let's get this book and let's do this. Some my whole family would do. Some they would just put me on. I was the kid who was like, how come she could have Sara Lee cake and I have to have the apple? So, it was, and some was done with love and some was done with like, well, let's just not let her eat anything.
Wow.
So, and I would lose weight and then I would gain it all back.
So some of those
Plus,
things worked, right?
oh, as I said to Dr. Cooper, well, they all worked. And then she said to me, well, if they worked, why are you here? And I was like, oh, well, I guess they didn't really work.
So they worked
Because
for a while, right? So
they always worked for a little
yeah.
while, and then within 6 months or so, everything came back. I mean, I did everything. I was like the aerobics queen. I did Jane Fonda. I mean, everything. I did every fad that came out. That was me.
Wow.
That's why I said, like, you name a diet, I could do it.
So, Emily,
But I
Yeah.
explain why that didn't work. I mean,
Yeah.
it works for a while, and people are like, because everybody now is like doing this intermittent fasting, and I think we're going
Oh
to
my
do an
god.
episode on
Yep.
that later. But just explain what's happening. It works for a while, but then it doesn't. So, what's happening?
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing is that people always act so surprised that this weight is coming back after this short-term loss. And even doctors sometimes are surprised and tell the patient, well, I don't know why that's happening. Um,
Well, they always
well,
blame they always
yeah,
would blame me. They'd say, "Well, you went off the
right, they do.
diet."
Oh, wow.
But actually it's predictable because that's what all the studies have shown. And in fact, the studies for over 100 years have shown that when you go on a diet, eventually your metabolism slows down and you will regain the weight. And often up to 22% more is very common. So, what I'm always surprised about is that the patients are so surprised that it happened. And because it's very predictable. And so, I wish that we were more truthful with our patients. If a doctor puts a patient on a diet, they really should be kind of getting what we call an informed consent to say, just like you would for a surgical procedure, for example, say, I'm going to put you on this diet, but what will happen is you will lose weight in the short term, but then, as Andrea pointed out, maybe 6 months later, your metabolism will be about 22% slower and you will be more prone to weight gain. And then when you gain the weight is going to come back in areas that are less healthy than where it is now, and you will be at greater risk for disease. So, do you want to go on this
Right.
diet or not? And, that's never part of the discussion, even though that is well known scientifically.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the doctors I'd like to give them
Yes.
some
Right.
credit that I don't think they
No, no,
knew
I,
that
I
either. I
agree.
mean, I really don't think that they understood fully that that was what they were doing to me.
No.
That, you
Right.
know, 50 years later, I was going to be pre-diabetic, have fatty liver, have
Yes.
you know, cholesterol problems, have all kinds of things because of every year that I was doing all these horrible diets, that was what was going to happen to me, and that I would end up, being 360 pounds or whatever it
Yeah.
was at the end of it, even though I was eating seriously less food than all of my skinny friends and eating kind of
And
healthy.
then when I
Yeah.
get involved, it's that there's an original kind of core metabolic problem that the patient may have had initially, like in your case, Andrea, maybe when you were
Right,
7 or 8 years old. But then
right,
because of all the dieting, superimposed on that original problem is another problem that we refer to as diet damage. Um,
right,
and the effect that that has had to make your metabolism weaker over time.
right.
So,
That's when she becomes the metabolic detective. And the thing is that even makes it more complicated is that my problem isn't your problem, Mark, and isn't
Mm,
like the other patients that are in Dr. Cooper's practice.
mhm,
So it becomes this huge issue that is overtaking pretty
mhm,
much all, most of America with having um, obesity issues and diabetic issues that need to be addressed, and also that that the whole country's feeling guilty
right.
about,
yeah.
and thinking is their fault.
And it,
Yeah.
yeah,
And when you look at the genetic diversity that's out there, it stands to reason that not every case of metabolic dysfunction is going to be the same. But when you look back to the
No,
origins, when we were all running around on the plains of Africa early in our history as human beings, the brain cared about one thing, and that was not dying.
no,
So
survival.
if we didn't have food for 3 or 4 days, of course the metabolism would slow down so that we didn't starve to
right, to
death.
protect us.
So
Right.
yeah,
It's
to
it's
protect
just
us.
logical, but we've lost
Yeah.
our sense of logic and common sense in this area. We don't see
Yeah.
it scientifically the way that we would see other things, and I think a lot of it has to do with the stigma around obesity and diabetes, and
Yeah.
this, the tendency to place that blame on the patient and put it all in their hands. So it's different. If you break your arm, your doctor's going to put a cast and tell you what to do. They're not going to send you home and tell you, like, you need to fix this, like they do
Yeah.
sometimes with weight and diabetes.
Andrea, I know that there are people listening to us right now who have lived the same path that you have, who have felt the shame, who felt frustration, who've felt, just really almost ridiculed sometimes
Yeah.
for body shape or body size. Talk to that person who's listening right now, Andrea, who's lived that path and is just at the end of their rope, because I know so many people who are like that.
Look, me too. I mean, it's really hard when when you finally get up the guts sometimes to go to a doctor and you realize, like, you get to the doctor's office, the gown doesn't fit you. They send you to get weighed down the hall, to a scale that is like for weighing a cow or whatever. And, it really is
Mm.
hard. Um, but I want to say to people that there are medical interventions that can help, and hopefully you can we can talk about some of the ways that there are, um, to think about it differently, and that it's not all about starvation anymore.
Mhm.
I think that for me, when I found out, first of all, when I found out that the brain was involved in the metabolism, that was like mind blowing to me because I thought it was always about what I ate. I think that was really a big changing time for me. And I actually think that helped with a lot of um, weight loss issues because it just freed a lot of my mind to not think about food all the time and not think about how it was my fault that I was doing things wrong. I wasn't doing anything right. Um, and I could just let things happen. I think that made a really big difference. And when you think that this is a long term process, it took me a long time to get there, and it was going to take a long time to get back. And it still isn't done. I mean,
No.
I got a long way to go still, but I don't worry
And I
about it
remember,
as
Andrea, when
much.
you did your workup and you said, wait, you mean it really is my hormones?
Right. I didn't really understand because to me, I thought hormones, that's just like your lady hormones, for like your period and for your non period. I didn't really fully understand what hormones meant. I didn't understand that they were the communication systems for your whole entire body. I didn't understand what that meant. And once I started understanding that hormones can be the communication system for your whole body. They can, uh, and that you can make them change with medication and with,
Fueling
um,
your body
the
better. Hmm.
and with different fuels and different ways to eat and
Not
different.
dieting.
I was like, yeah, it was like, oh my God, this really, there's hope for it to change. Um, that changed everything for
Hmm.
me. And I think that that makes a really big difference.
I think so too.
So
And I think in
I
Mark's
think that,
case, coming in and finding out you have metabolic syndrome, that is actually a very common situation because over half of our population has either diabetes or prediabetes now. And metabolic syndrome is a type of high risk metabolic dysfunction that prediabetes can be a component. But 90% of people with prediabetes don't know they have it. It's literally undiagnosed in 90% of people. So that's, one of the things that why it caught Mark by surprise because he had undiagnosed prediabetes.
right, because nobody tests. Like, I didn't know what my A1C was until it was a major problem. I didn't know what all those numbers were all about. Nobody tests for any of that stuff.
So, Emily, tell us why prediabetes is so important to catch because there's what, something like 37 million Americans have full blown diabetes. But talk about the danger of prediabetes.
Well, you really can't get to diabetes without first going through prediabetes.
Hmm.
So that's really where the importance of catching it is because until you really are fully into diabetes, it's completely reversible. And I see it as there's no reasons anyone should get diabetes. Although, I mean, there can be case exceptions where something unusual happens. But if we were doing a better job of screening and communicating with patients and treating early intervention for prediabetes, our diabetes numbers would be dramatically reduced. And once you are progressing to diabetes, now you've got all kinds of problems and potential complications, ranging from blindness to neuropathy, amputations, circulatory problems, more heart disease, kidney disease, dialysis.
Your eyes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a friend
Yes.
who just lost his sight. He's not
Uh,
much older than I
uh-huh.
am, but from diabetes, and
Yeah.
it's just a perfect storm of disease, right? Once the
Right.
body gets attacked in that way.
And the testing is so easy to
Yeah.
do. That's what's so crazy. And no,
Yeah.
like I would say, as soon as I started doing getting tests and stuff, I asked a lot of my friends, like, do you know your A1C? Do you know what your test is? And nobody did.
Hmm.
Nobody did.
And
No
the
doctors.
testing guidelines have weighed very heavily on who should be tested are people with high weight. And that's
Yeah.
starting to change a little bit because about a quarter of people with normal weight also have metabolic syndrome and risk for diabetes. So hopefully things will change. I think the American Diabetes Association started to change their guidelines so that regardless of weight, at a certain age, people are starting to test now.
Yeah.
But that's what the recommendations are, and what happens in reality is not always the same.
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't, it's never, I don't think it's usually covered under insurance
Yeah, it
either.
is. It is.
Like
Well,
to,
I mean, a
is it?
glucose test is very inexpensive, and it's part of what's called the
Yeah.
comprehensive metabolic panel. It's part of a lot of panels. I honestly think that
Right.
people have got to be their own advocate. You know,
Right. That's what I've made all my
yeah.
friends get it.
Well, this has been an amazing start. And I think it's the start of something that's going to be really incredible because every week we're going to get to talk with people and talk with each other about solutions to why we get fat and solutions as to how we can get healthier, which is the real key here. Well, this has been so much fun. Dr. Emily Cooper, Andrea Taylor, thank you so much for being here. And that's Fat Science for this week.
No diets, no agendas, just science to make you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.